Good evening, everyone, and once again, thank you for joining me for the Look into the Holy Book devotional time, Thursday evenings. I am your host, Charles Logan, and it is my privilege to share these thoughts with you this evening. Now, I might start by saying we've had a rough couple of days here lately, and I'd like to talk about my thoughts on that next Thursday during our devotional time then. But tonight, I want to talk about heaven without time and a world without eternity. We're going to be looking into the book of Ephesians and also Ecclesiastes. I was visiting a good friend the other day. He's 94 years old. He's a veteran of the Korean War. Now, his mind is as sharp as a tack. However, he relives those memories about that war 70 years ago quite often. Now, we sat and we talked and we looked, and he looked at me and he said, rather wistfully, I might add, he said, "Where is time gone?" As usual, I nodded in agreement and said that I had thought about that often myself. Now, when we were much younger, we didn't seem to be thinking that time was very important, other than anticipating those memorable events like Christmas or dreading those anxious times like wait until your father gets home. Today, much like my friend says, time seems to pass in light speed. For some reason, though, his words stayed with me after I got home, and I started thinking about time and how our very lives revolve around the time and how the passage of time seems to go faster the older that we get. I don't know why, but the very essence of time has taken on a different perspective since I crossed that golden age barrier. I'm much more aware of my mortality, thinking more often about the things that I want to do in the limited time that I have to do them. Now, I can't help but feel a sense of urgency about my ministries too, and I hope to have the time to accomplish the things that I want to in the time that I have left. There's no question that we Christians live our lives knowing full well that our time here is limited and that we are to make the best use of our time that we're given while at the same time looking forward to eternity. Now, Paul says it very well when he wrote in Philippians 1:21, "To live is Christ, but to die is gain." Sometimes we are so wound up in pursuing our activities and racing against the clock to get everything done that we don't realize that God gave his greatest creation the gift of time so that mankind could organize his life to use his time productively. In fact, time is such an integral part of our lives that we can't imagine life without it. Yet we really don't think about what it is. It's not something that we can touch or hold. It's not something that we can save up and use later. And it's not something that we can stop to avoid something bad happening. In reality, time is something that is in constant motion. Like the movements of the universe. It's nebulous, like the dark matter that makes up the space between objects and the cosmos. Time is looking back to memories, or looking forward to hopes and to plans. You know, it is the substance that gives us life when you think about it. Think about the cells that make up our bodies and the constant motion of the molecules that make us who we are. It is the circadian cycles of night and day, seasons, and years and ages. It is one long moving picture of the progress of events and existence in the past, now, and in the future. It is a means of keeping everything from happening at once. And it was one of the first and most important gifts that God gave to man so that he could organize his life and exercise his free will. Now, as the title of our devotional this evening says, heaven is without time and our world is without eternity. That is, for us, mankind. It is for us to try to get an understanding of a timeless heaven. The gift of time is necessary for man to develop a vision of time that would allow him the ability to glimpse and understand the concept of eternity. So, have you ever thought about what life would be like without time? Since time is such a part of our lives, it's a thought that has probably never occurred to most of us, but perspectives and attitudes, relationships, and life itself would take on a totally different meaning. There would be no memories to look back on, nor hopes for the future to look forward to. Our existence would be forever in the moment. Since our personalities are part and parcel of the events that occur in our lives, we would have no personality, no relationships, no future, no hope, and no need for forgiveness. But God, in his infinite wisdom and yes, his love for us, gave us all of those things when he gave us order. One use of that gift is to develop relationships, loving and long-lasting relationships that contribute to the richness of our lives. Along with time, God instilled within us the desire to know our Creator and to come to a loving and obedient relationship with him. And within that relationship, a desire to know more about our Creator, God gave us a desire to live forever. And that desire is manifested through a relationship with his Son, who serves as our pathway to eternity. With the salvation that he provides, we come to understand, within the context of our finite minds, of course, what it means to live for eternity. Our first verse to consider this evening is found in Ephesians 5:15 to 16. And it says, "See, then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming time because the days are evil." Now, when you get down to it, time is a uniquely temporal concept. It is only relevant for the short time that we're given on this earth. We Christians mark time as the sequence of events along this journey to eternity. While we have a limited capacity to understand eternity, we know enough to realize that it is timeless. And once again, God gave us sufficient time to know him and to rely and trust on him completely. 2 Corinthians 6:2 says, "For he says, at the acceptable time I listened to you, and on the day of salvation I helped you. Behold, now is the acceptable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation." Now, it might be an oversimplification on my part, but as Christ followers, we necessarily have to look at time as our obligation to use it wisely. Use it to witness and to use our gift of time to live a Christ-like life. And of course, to prepare ourselves for eternity. I particularly like the verses in Ecclesiastes 3, 1 to 8. To me, these verses define our time living on this earth as Christians. While looking forward to the future, I suppose any devotional about our lives and God's gift of time would not be complete without these words to think about. So let's start with verse number 1. And I know that you've heard these many, many times, but I'm hoping to share a little bit of a different perspective with you. Verse number 1 says, "There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven." Now, first of all, at the risk of sounding redundant, the concept of time is a uniquely temporal necessity, as it is under heaven, and that, of course, would be this earth. Also, there is a time for everything, and everything has its time. Now, continuing in verse 2, a time to give birth, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to uproot what is planted. I believe that the writer of Ecclesiastes is looking back and using his own experiences and memories to illustrate the life cycle of one of God's chosen people. That wonderful, God-given spark of life that begins this earthly journey. And as old as this poem is, it also speaks to us today. Today, and in Solomon's day, we all have the same desires and needs and emotions. Not only are we brought into this world with all of its distractions, though through the miracle of birth, but we are born a second time, which frees us from the burden of original sin because of Christ's gift of salvation and forgiveness. Now, not only is there birth and renewal within that divine spark of life, the abundance of the earth's produce is there for the benefit of God's greatest creation. And yet, because of this limited time that we have here on this terrestrial ball, there is always an end which comes with the physical death, a death to the corruptible that is necessary for God's faithful to realize eternal life in a timeless paradise. So there is the life cycle of birth and death, planting, harvest, and renewal. Unlike for those who are not faithful followers, who will experience a physical death and a spiritual death, God's children will only experience that necessary transitional physical death. Verse number 3 continues, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up. God is a merciful God and wants everyone to make the conscious decision to come to him. And God gives everyone the time to make that decision. Also, the reconciliation and healing of old wounds is necessary, and showing compassion to a defeated enemy is a demonstration of mercy. It is also necessary for people of a destroyed nation to be restored as a sense of resolution and renewal. Verse number 4 says a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. As I've said in previous devotions, God's gift of time comes with the wonderful gift of experiencing emotions. These feelings are uniquely human and help build that repertoire of memories that so contribute to each of our own persona. The greatest gift is the capacity to love, and along with that naturally comes the ability to experience grief. It is a time that God gives us to come to terms with deeply personal losses. But there is also a time to express joy and happiness. That happiness with the realization that our ultimate joy is to be free of sadness and live for eternity, praising God who created us and worship forever with friends and family and all of the other saints in heaven who have preceded us. And of course, there will be time to dance and rejoice in a place beyond our wildest and most wonderful dreams. Verse number 5 says, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. And to me, this was a little bit more complex couplet to understand, particularly in our 21st century perspective. Perhaps it refers to our human tendency to be territorial and defensive, or perhaps our nature to hold grudges until unresolved issues have been settled. It can refer to the ancient practice of destroying an enemy's ability to resurrect anything from their ruins. It might be as simple as showing hostility instead of friendship. So no matter how you understand it, it teaches us that an overture to reconciliation is certainly good advice for us today. I would hope that we would use our time to seek common ground to reconcile those broken ties rather than carry grudges that can only work to lengthen those distances between those who would spread disharmony and those who would strive for reconciliation, whether it be family or friends or local or even globally. Verse number 6, a time to search and a time to give up as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away. God also gave us a wonderful, inquisitive mind. But have we gone too far in our search for the answer to the beginnings of the universe and even life itself? Is man, in his search for answers, giving himself too much credit? Now, I believe that our Creator, God, is brilliant enough to place a desire in mankind to want to go beyond what he can't explain, but in so doing risking the chance of placing himself above the God who created him. We know that historically and mythologically, man has sought to know the mind of God before. Discoveries are made and lost over time, only to be rediscovered again. There's nothing new under the sun, and nothing takes God by surprise. Verse number 7, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to speak. In a chaotic world, we've seen voices of radicals drown out the voices of reason. We see images all the time of people with nefarious agendas trying to tear down the history and traditions that have been built up over time by courage and tenacity. And I'm hoping that a kind of silence has settled over the mob violence that we have seen recently. A voice of reason in the midst of chaos. There's now room for that groundswell of Christian revivalism among young people that we have so desperately needed for such a long time. And I truly believe that in light of the tragic events of yesterday, that the momentum will only grow more intense to serve to re-energize the movement. That is my hope and my prayer. Verse number 8. A time to love, a time to hate, a time for war, and a time for peace. It is fitting that the author of this poem would choose to complete the list with a contrast between the fatalism that is evident in these couplets and the hope that lives within the hearts of the faithful. Especially in our present time, love is the cure for all the ills that plague this messed up world. Yet love of our fellow man, which is the will of God, a God that loves each of us individually, is out of place where many have rejected Christ's message of peace. However, there will be that final battle between the forces of good and evil will be defeated forever when this world returns to the domain of a victorious Christ. You know, we can be forever grateful that God has given us this gift of time to seek happiness of a carefree youth, time to grow in spiritual and physical maturity, and time to be productive members of society and raise a family in a Christian environment, and time to reflect on those golden years, and time to come to terms with their own mortality. Now, we've talked about a world without eternity because the understanding of eternity is reserved for heaven. I have to admit, I once said that God has given us time to understand eternity, certainly has gifted us with the passage of time, but I'm not so sure that we will ever really understand eternity until we experience it firsthand. Eternity is not the absence of time as we understand time, but it is certainly timeless, like the nature of love is timeless. You know, my 90-year-old friend defines his life through his time in Korea, recalling the terror of bursting shells and machine gun fire and frozen ground. But he also marks that time with the comfort of his faith, faith that is his constant companion to this day. So I would end our time together this evening by saying that heaven is timeless because it is eternal. And the world that we live in, even temporarily as it is, will only be eternal when Christ returns to rule over a new world from the New Jerusalem. Well, thank you so much for joining me again this evening. I know our devotional was a little bit longer than usual, but once again, I hope that you've taken something valuable from it. So once again, I thank you for taking the time to join me this evening. And remember, next week, I'll be talking about blessed are the peacemakers. So until then, Lord willing, we can get together again next Thursday. I wish each and every one of you a good evening and a good night.